We live in a time of unprecedented change. In terms of globalization, technology, electronics, research, weapons, transportation, and innovation, the midpoint of world history was the Second World War. As much has happened in human history prior to World War II than since World War II. If you were born in 1940, you were born in about the middle of human history. Moreover, the rate of change continues to accelerate. In terms of change, 1 year today is like 5 years a few decades ago. That means that each generation has grown up in a fundamentally different world. My mother was born before radio broadcasts were available. When I was born, less than half of 1% of Americans had a television. Today, my 33-year-old daughter is a global business and technology consultant, and my 3-year-old granddaughter can operate a smartphone and an iPad. Yet these vastly different generations must communicate and work together across tremendously different life experiences and with increasingly complex technologies. The rapid change that continues to occur has led to global instability, new opportunity, disorientation, rapid innovation, disruption, and abrupt obsolescence. As we have discussed on a recent ITC video conference, disruption has occurred in every industry: media, transportation, business, education, politics, and virtually every other institution we know. This presents problems and opportunities. Complicating this accelerating rate of change and disruption is the fact that we work side by side with vastly different generations with unique life experiences. Today, at least 4 generations comprise today's workforce. The oldest large group of people alive today is called the silent generation, the lost generation, or the baby bust generation. Born between 1930 and 1945, they were a small generation as the birth rate was low during the Great Depression and World War II of the first half of the 1940s. They tend to be a conservative generation, and given that the youngest of them is 71 years old, they are rapidly disappearing from the workplace. They are known for their work ethic, stability, loyalty, and had predictable career paths, often working for just 1 or 2 organizations during their entire lives. The late 1940s ushered in the baby boom. Born between 1946 and 1964, this was the largest generation in history. They were born in a world of change and changed the world even more in which they grew up. They matured along with the civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, rock and roll, the peace movement, environmentalism, and women's liberation. They have been called the most radical, the most hedonistic, and the most change-oriented. They celebrated instant gratification, lifestyle experimentation, psychological growth, radical causes, and alternative lifestyles. They shocked their parents and discarded many of the moral, sexual, political, and family values of the prior generation. As a result, boomers have the largest generation gap with their parents of any generation. Until recently, they were the largest generation and comprised the majority of the world's workforce. Although they are no longer the largest generation or the majority of the workforce, they are the majority of managers, executives, educators, and political leaders in the world today. Following the baby boom came Generation X, comprised of people born between 1965 and 1980. Gen X is smaller generation, partly the result of widespread dissemination of the birth control pill in 1964, which was a major factor in decreasing family sizes starting in the mid-1960s. Gen Xers not only lived in the shadow of the much larger and louder baby boom generation, they had to deal with a high divorce rate, dual earner families, and an international drug epidemic. They were the first generation of mostly latchkey kids that learned to live on their own. They are often described as street-savvy, independent, self-directed generation that is skeptical of politics, organizations, government, and authority in general. Increasingly, they are rising high in their organizations and may constitute the majority of managers and business leaders by the end of the decade. However, Generation X will face several dilemmas. It is a generation that valued autonomy and often resisted management supervision. It is unclear if managers from Generation X and from the millennial generation will subscribe to the previous management models or consider increased flex time, autonomy, telecommuting, and a flatter organizational structure. Also called Generation Y, Echo Boomers, and Generation Me, Millennials, are the largest generation throughout the world, including North America, Central America, and South America. They are quite different than any prior generation. Born between 1980 and 1995, this generation is tech-savvy, self-oriented, connected via social media, liberal, self-determining, distrustful of institutions, self-disciplined, and closer to their parents than any generation alive today. They are less scarred by war or poverty than any prior generation, though they've had to weather terrorism, drug abuse, and economic recession. Many of them live with their parents, with little or no stigma associated with that choice. They tend not to have as large a generation gap with their parents as previous generations. Demographic trends and globalization have combined to make our workforce more multi-generational and diverse. In this context, various studies indicate that by 2016, millennials will replace the baby boomers as the largest generation. And in 5 years, they will represent almost half of the entire workforce. By 2025, millennials will make up 75% of the U.S. workforce. The implications of these dynamics for organizations and communities around the world are significant, given the idiosyncrasies of these millennials and the other generations that must interact and work with them in an increasingly difficult and challenging global landscape. So what are the ways in which this large and increasingly dominant millennial generation differ from prior generations? What kind of personal and institutional adjustments are needed to optimize and accommodate this generation? Looking at millennials, their attitudes, behaviors, and values is like peering into a crystal ball, since they soon will be the overwhelmingly predominant generation on Earth. Mass media as we knew it, particularly the ubiquitous television news, is a creaky shadow of its former self. Millennials are not tuning into television in general, and television news in particular. Today, news programs are targeted at aged views, as indicated by their sponsors: arthritis medications, laxatives, erectile dysfunction drugs, catheters, and wheelchairs, because that is their largest target audience. The average age of television news viewers is 55, and the average age of Fox News organization viewers is 68. Similarly, reading newspapers is at an all-time low among all generations, but it is particularly low for millennials. In the United States and many other countries, it is hard to find a millennial that reads a daily newspaper. As a result, many newspapers have gone out of business, and the field of journalism has been shaken to its core. Millennials believe that the internet is a better source for news than television, magazine, newspapers, and this is true throughout the world. To the extent that millennials are getting news at all, they're getting it from their smartphones, on Facebook or Twitter, with news links often posted, sent, or retweeted by friends. Polls show that 2/3 of millennials get news daily, and over 80% think keeping up with the news is important. There is more focus on stories of interest, and most millennials follow 5 or less stories each day. Instead of listening to broadcasts, they are much more likely to visit a website on demand, get information from friends via social media, or access news through political comedians on television or online. Indeed, over 88% of millennials in the United States get news from Facebook regularly, and 50% get news from Facebook daily. Interestingly, social media via the smartphone is omnipresent throughout the world. Latin American millennials are not an exception, and they are poised to receive news via social media since nearly 3/4 of them have smartphones, a percentage that is fairly similar globally. Across the world, according to the Global Telefonica study, millennials think that the internet has benefited their country and the world. 87% think the internet has overcome international language barriers. 83% think it has made it easier to get a job. And 69% think it has benefited everyone, not just a select few. However, worldwide millennials believe that the internet has widened the gap between the rich and poor. In Latin America, however, millennials differ from the rest of the world, since a slight majority believe that technology and the internet has shrunk the gap between rich and poor. There is a perception, based in the life and experience of Latin American millennials, that technology is the key to personal success and overall societal achievement. As for technology throughout the world, millennials are digital natives, comfortable with their smartphones, tablets, social media, and computers in all their forms. More than 90% of millennials in Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and the United States access their Facebook account daily, and most access Facebook from their phone, not their laptop or desktop computers. Over 60% of both Mexican and U.S. millennials watch a video online each day. The Telefonica Global Survey of Millennials found that in both Latin America and the United States, millennials on average spend 7 hours a day online. Smartphones are owned by nearly 70% of Latin American millennials, 71% of U.S. millennials, 79% of those in Western Europe, and 82% of millennials in Asia. This can be an opportunity for educators and employers. Never before has a generation had this amount of information at their fingertips. They can access almost anything from their Instagram or Facebook networks to websites, e-commerce sites, and perhaps most importantly, business-to-business websites. When a company is looking for a supplier, millennials can quickly shop online with their phone or computer for the best price and product. This has produced an instant global marketplace that is truly capitalistic and competitive, a fact that is particularly important in developing countries seeking the best price for their supply chain. But a Pew Research study discovered millennials will both benefit and suffer from their hyper-connected lives. Many millennials are social media addicts. They find it very difficult to stop texting, emailing, and Facebooking. Throughout the world, millennials engage in frightening practices by using smartphones while walking, bicycling, or driving cars. This can be a huge problem at work, where some millennials spend a good portion of their workday texting or socializing instead of working. Clearly, managers must monitor this practice and have procedures in place to curb this use of personal technology while at work. Outright bans on smartphones are probably too strict for millennials and fail to recognize the reality of smartphone use here in 2016 and could cause great dissatisfaction and turnover among millennial employees. Some managers have resorted to giving them a project and a deadline and holding them accountable for getting it done without resorting to monitoring their social media use. Unfortunately, less than 1 in 5 companies in the United States had a policy on social media on the job. Managers, business owners, and educators can simply Google social media policy to find examples of how organizations throughout the world are dealing with this issue. Millennials like dialogue, and one of the best ways to address the issue of phone use and social media at work is to involve employees in designing and implementing a smartphone policy. It is important to provide social media and technology training to all employees, and addressing personal use of phones and social media should be a part of that training. As consumers, it is clear that millennials throughout the world shop online with no regard to national boundaries. A huge study by Ipsos of 20,000 consumers throughout Latin America found that in 2016, 2/3 of millennials made a purchase online. And in many Latin American countries, nearly half of millennials made a foreign purchase online. It is clear that this massive young generation is globalized economically. This should be a cautionary note for all countries, particularly in Latin America. Millennials are shopping internationally, and that money is not being spent domestically. To play in this arena, all businesses in Latin America need a robust international online presence to attract purchases by millennials from other countries. Finally, there is widespread concern in the Pew Global Survey about the effect of smartphones and internet on cognitive and intellectual processes. Replacing one's brain with Google searches may create atrophy of certain mental processes, and millennials may be prone to make quick, impulsive, and simple choices rather than engaging in deeper, more complex thought processes. Moreover, many experts, according to the Pew study, believe that quick internet searches from smartphones have led to impatience and inattention. Concentrating on a complex problem, deep engagement with a topic, reading a full-length book, or participating in a nuanced debate may be outside of the core cognitive competencies of many millennials. But the key for millennial success and empowerment, both real and perceived, is through education. With regard to education, millennials are a highly educated generation compared to prior ones. Illiteracy is low among this generation, and many more millennials are going to college than any prior generation. Throughout the world, according to the Telefonica study, 42% of millennials think that access to education is the most important path to improving the world. This belief is higher among Latin American millennials than anywhere else in the world. 53% believe that education is the key to an improving world. Clearly, this is an opportunity for Latin America. Millennials in Latin America are ready for education, and a major investment must be made in education by government and the private sector. We are doing our part here at the International Training Center to provide education for millennials in Latin America. But all segments of society should increase efforts to try to deliver cutting-edge global knowledge for this generation who clearly believes education is the path forward. Interestingly, according to the Telefonica survey, millennials believe that the most important area of study to their future success is technology. And Latin American millennials are most likely among the world's region to believe that mastering technology is the key to personal success in the future. Clearly, Latin American millennials are ready for schools to step up and provide such a cutting-edge education that included technological competence. A sense of being a privileged, exceptional generation probably started with the baby boomers back in the 50s and 60s. Parents had delayed having babies during the 1930s Depression and the first half of 1940s during World War II. The parents of these delayed babies were so overjoyed to start a family that these baby boomers were more loved, nurtured, educated, coddled, and entitled than any prior generation. However, there is little doubt that millennials have taken entitlement to a whole new level. Increasingly, they believe that families, schools, government, and businesses owe this generation an affluent and easy lifestyle. Jean Twenge, my colleague here at San Diego State University, has demonstrated in her book, Generation Me, today's youngest generation were anointed by their parents as the chosen ones. They were all told they were special by their baby boomer parents, and they believed it. Schools changed from criticism of students and their work to rewarding every student for even small accomplishments. In high school, my daughter had an entire wall of awards and plaques. Generation Me was told they could be whatever they wanted to be, however far-fetched it was to become an NBA player, president of a Fortune 500 company, or a Hollywood star. Millennials think they deserve it all: money, career, family, love, fun, and a rich personal life. Dr. Twenge has shown that narcissism, a preoccupation with the self, is higher among millennials than any prior generation. Indeed, the selfie has become the iconic image of this generation. Likewise, posting a picture or a person's dinner plate or sunset on Facebook would seem preposterous to older generations, but it is common among millennials. There is a bright side to this high degree of self-centrism. It just may be that narcissism and individualism has trained millennials to be more self-reliant and better individual contributors. One of the paradoxes of millennials is that a large portion of this very entitled generation feels a deep sense of social responsibility. Maybe in a strange way they go hand in hand. Their privilege should be shared. A majority of millennials in Latin America and in the US believe that a job should be more than making a living. It should be a catalyst to improve society and the environment. A recent Brookings Institute study found that nearly 2/3 of millennials want their employer to contribute to social or ethical causes. According to the Telefonica study, globally, 41% of millennials say that protecting the environment is the key driver of future change. And this is consistent across the globe, but highest in Latin America, where 53% of millennials think that environmental protection is a key driver of change. Educators and employers should think more carefully about social and environmental responsibility if they are to attract, motivate, retain millennial employees. How is your organization making a difference in the world? The growth of organizations like Sistema B in South America has created a focus of social responsibility of an organization. Through assessment, change, and certification, Sistema B seeks to create organizations that feature shared governance, best practices, and environmental sensitivity. Millennials across the world think that climate change is a very important issue. In most countries, 1/3 to half of millennials think climate change is important, but in Latin America, it's a world high 70% that think climate change is a pressing issue, including 83% of those in Colombia, 72% of those in Chile, and 70% of those in Brazil. Across the world, millennials rate the economy as the #1 issue facing the world. The exceptions are in Latin America, where social inequality and education are the most important issues, and in the Middle East, where terrorism and political unrest are the most important issues. Interestingly, according to the Telefonica study, both North America and Latin American millennials are most likely to believe they can affect their local communities and countries. In both regions, 82% of millennials believe that they can make a local difference. This sense of empowerment and efficacy is key to success of this generation going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Let's now go to Module 2 of this program.